In the last lecture, we looked at a brief modern history of China's modernization efforts. We examined the periods of 1840 to 1910, 1911 to 1949, 1949 to 1978, and 1978 to 2012. In particular, our concern was to see the relationship between modernization and the political, economic, and social structures. In this lecture, we turn our attention to the political and economic reforms which commenced from 1978. When Deng Xiaoping passed away, Jiang Zemin mentioned in his eulogy the contributions of his mentor on political reforms and declared the intention of the Chinese Communist Party to deepen the reform of the political structure and run the nation according to the rule of law. More importantly, at the 15-Party Congress in September 1997, Jiang devoted some space in his report calling for efforts to, quote, continue to press ahead with the reform of the political structure, further extend the scope of socialist democracy, and improve the socialist legal system, governing the country according to law and making it a socialist country ruled by law. This no doubt had reunited interest in sizing up China's moves in political reforms. It may be recalled that the suggestion of having political reforms in the post-Mao period started in earnest with Deng Xiaoping when he delivered a speech on the reform of the system of party and state leadership to a large meeting of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the CCP in August 1980. Many of the problems and suggestions by Deng on party-state relations, tenure of cadres, leadership and bureaucratic styles, and others were further discussed by Deng himself, notably in 1986, and resulted in the formal proposal to have political reforms by the then General Secretary Zhao Ziyang at the 13th Party in October 1987. However, the incident of June 1989 put a stop to whatever progress that might have been made in political reforms. In fact, any public discussions on political reforms after the incident were considered to be politically unwise and were looked upon with great suspicion and skepticism. It remains to be noted that the leadership, notably Deng, did not seem to have wavered much on the need to introduce political reforms. He maintained that the resolutions of the 13th Party Congress should not be altered. Thus, while the pace of political reform was evidently slowed down, the 14th Party Congress in October 1992 did reiterate superficially the need for political restructuring, socialist democracy, and the development of China's legal system, amongst other things. Interestingly, when the 15th Party Congress was convened in September 1997, the first Party Congress after the death of Deng, the CPC seemed interested in carrying on with Deng's unfinished agenda of political reforms. The key question we need to ask ourselves, why political reforms? What are the major emphases? How would the political reforms change the Chinese political system? In this lecture, we will answer these questions and throw some light onto the challenges of reforms in China. After 50 years of revolutionary transformation and an uneven consolidation, and a generation of economic restructuring, the political institutions of the People's Republic of China remain essentially Leninist. In fact, the CPC continues to enjoy monopoly power, and independent media, autonomous trade unions, and other manifestations of civil society was somewhat muted or perhaps wholly absent. Yet the environment with which the party now operates has changed fundamentally. Marxist-Leninist parties in power have collapsed around the world, and to stay in power, the CPC had abandoned central planning for market economics. Living standards and literacy rates have improved dramatically, and ordinary people now have more control over their own lives. Some analysts have suggested that as a result of these changes, the regime is facing imminent institutional collapse. Others have suggested that the regime cannot only chart a course towards democratization. What we might argue, however, is that the regime is more resilient than either of these interpretations allow. In spite of the formal trappings of Leninism and its neo-authoritarian political reform program, the CPC has adapted to the new situation. The reforms, which date from the early 1980s, have considerably strengthened the country's political institutions. Although there is still disagreement on the content and pace of reform, China's elite, with very few exceptions, appear to agree that further political reforms is necessary. Yet the party is caught in a dilemma. If it moves too slowly, it could fail because it cannot meet the demands of the people. If it moves too quickly, it could also fail because it further undermines its already weakened position. China's political system continues to exhibit the characteristics of a mature Leninist state. According to the 1982 state constitution, party rule is legitimized by the four basic principles. Chief among these is the principle that asserts that the hegemony of the CPC. Others continue to define the state as a people's democratic sort of entity where the economy is socialist and the defining ideology is Marxist-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. These values, which champion organizational concepts such as democratic centralism and the mass line, resonate with the language of the 1940s and 1950s party documents. There has been some modifications, mind you, but they have been relatively minor. Thus, in 1987, then Party Secretary General Zhao Ziyang recharacterized China's economic system as being in the primary stage of socialism, a move that permeated the party to introduce market-oriented policies, protect private property, and encourage private entrepreneurship to develop the economy. Still, China's constitution continues to legitimize a monoistic political system, formally recognizing the hegemony of the CPC. Moreover, the party continues to repress any attempts to organize challenges to its authority. As it was by the mid-1950s, the CPC today remains relatively small and coherent. First, it continues to be an elite, but rather than a mass party. In the late 1990s, it had 62 million members, or approximately 5% of the total population. Although party membership has grown as a percentage of the population, the relatively small size of the party has been kept deliberately small. Membership continues to be very selective. In fact, surveys indicate that it continues to be highly sought after, although perhaps not as much as it was in 1949 and 1950. Second, evidence for the party discipline in 1998 was its ability to ensure that its nominees were elected to national and local governments, as well as to People's Congress posts in more than 98% of the cases. While party discipline may have declined in recent times, undermined, for example, by corruption, still, given its vast size, in comparative terms, the CPC is still relatively tightly disciplined. In fact, it may be more disciplined now than it was in the early 1950s, where it was flush with victory and absorbing a huge number of new recruits. The organization of the party bureaucracy has also remained fundamentally unchanged. First, the system that centralizes power in the Politburo and in territorial party secretaries and their committees continues to be unchanged. Second, the Central Committee and local territorial committees continue to set up general offices and organization and a united front work departments. The function of these departments have also remained remarkably constant, although the scope of their authority has varied with decentralization and now re-centralization. The structure of provincial party committees in the late 1980s, for example, closely resembled committees set up in the mid-1950s. From 1952 to 1996, although the state went through 6 major rounds of restructuring, the impact of reforms was relatively modest, and in no sense did they change the character of party or state institutions. Third, authorities continue to rely on decision-making and policy-implementing institutions, such as party-leading small groups. The leadership system within the party continues to give primacy to party secretaries and higher-level territorial committees. Formally, the party continues to value collective leadership and democratic centralism. That is, there appears to have been relatively little organizational innovation or reinvention of the CPC. Since 1949, the CPC has maintained itself in power through control over leadership selection in all strategic groups and the control of the military. The fundamental principle of personnel administration laid down in the 1920s that, quote, the party manages cadres has continued to guide organizational work since 1949. In short, the party continues to rule through its control of leadership selection, not only of government agencies at all administrative levels, but of the legislature, judiciary, the military, strategic economic enterprises, the media, and mass organizations such as the All China Federation of Trade Unions. During the early periods of reforms, both China's external and internal environments have changed substantially since 1949. Change has been especially significant in the external environment. First, the collapse of Leninist parties in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe robbed the CPC of allies and some legitimacy. This development underscored the importance of appropriately handling the relationship between the economic and political reforms, and probably reinforced the leadership's view that any political reform program must suit China's national characteristics. That is, it should preserve the monopoly position of the CPC. Second, the party's decision to integrate China's economy within the world economy not only boosted economic development, but opened the nation to new sources of information and managerial technologies, and contributed to the pluralization of Chinese society. Third, the diffusion of modern technology has been quite pronounced. With this, a sort of exposure to new modern technologies is exposure to new ideas that has made governing China much more complex. Finally, based largely on successful economic development, China has emerged as a major player on the world scene that has to be taken seriously by global players. The nation's new international position has undoubtedly reinforced the leadership's self-confidence that it can effectively manage affairs of state both home and abroad. The internal environment has also changed dramatically. As a result of years of economic reforms, the nation has witnessed years of high economic growth and rising living standards. Indeed, it is probably true to say that a new middle class has emerged, composing of entrepreneurs and professionals, and especially this is the case in China's urban core. Second, China has undergone rapid urbanization and industrialization. From 1952 to 1997, for example, China's total population living in cities grew from 12 to 30%, while the number of people engaged in agriculture has fallen from 70.5% in 1978 to 47.5% in 1997. Finally, literacy rates have risen sharply during the last few decades. These rapid changes have placed many more resources in the hands of ordinary individuals. They are freer to live where they like, choose their own occupation, buy goods and services from a variety of public and private providers, as well as to travel globally. Indeed, managing China's new mobile population has become a new and major preoccupation of the state. The state continues to try to control what people may publish and read, with whom they may potentially associate with, and under what conditions they may speak in the public domain. The economic restructuring has been accompanied by considerable dislocation. This has resulted in rising unemployment. The reforms has also been accompanied by a huge increase in the incidence of corruption, even though there have been anti-corruption campaigns. When it comes to expressions of discontent, Chinese citizens have expressed their discontent to government officials through a variety of means, both legal and illegal. On the one hand, they have attempted to present their cases to officials through existing public channels, such as through local leaders, people's congresses, and official trade unions. When formal legal channels fail, Chinese citizens have turned to other methods of protest. For example, by the late 1990s, protest demonstrations and violence were becoming more commonplace throughout China. Protesters demanded compensation for stock swindling, reduced fees and taxes, the elimination of corruption, increased compensation for giving up their housing, the abandonment of enterprise privatization, and payment of stipends for laid-off workers. The party has reacted to these incidents with a renewed call for stability. Indeed, stability had once again become the single most important goal of the party leadership. We will talk more about discontent and regime repression in future lectures. It should be emphasized at the outset that when Beijing talks about political reforms, it is not interested in having Western democratic arrangements, for example, the separation of power, bi-party or multi-party systems, parliamentary democracy, or other aspects of the Western political system. For China, the Western model is a recipe for instability. It leads to destruction of socialist norms and legal values, and it can lead to a political impasse. Nevertheless, Chinese leaders have recognized the need for political reform since the 1950s and early 1960s. In fact, during this period, the party attempted to restructure the state on several occasions, and to establish a system of people's congresses, provide for basic level elections, and establish legal institutions. In the wake of the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping put political reform on the party's agenda in 1980. By then, it came to mean reform of the leadership system, constitutional reform, and the creation of new institutions within the CPC to supervise discipline. It was again on the agenda in 1986 and 1987. During the 13th-Party Congress, then Party Secretary General Zhao Ziyang called for the establishment of a new civil service system, separating the functions of the party and government, further perfecting the People's Congress system, and strengthening the rule of law. After the June 1989 incident and the decline and problems of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the concern with peaceful evolution and bourgeois liberalization would reinforce Beijing's determination to adhere closely to its socialism with Chinese characteristics mantra. While it may want to borrow strengths from capitalism, it is based on the rationalization that China needs to go through the primary stage of socialism in order to reach socialism. To be sure, it is relatively more relaxed in accepting modern technology, science, investment, and trade from the West for the sake of its four modernizations. However, it is still a lot more reserved and restrained to political sort of traditions, values, and practices. It should also be noted Beijing has been persistent in following the four cardinal principles we discussed in our earlier slides in launching those political reforms. Again, those principles are to keep up the socialist road, to uphold the rule of the proletariat, uphold the leadership of the Communist Party, and uphold Marxist, Leninist, and Mao Zedong thought. These principles were laid down by Deng in 1979, and the principles eventually boiled down to the unchallenged leadership and dominance of the CPC. Deng Xiaoping made no disguise that this must be the case. As will be shown and illustrated in our later lectures, this has restricted the political space for non-party actors or inputs. One of the most important reasons for political reforms was no doubt related to the economic reforms and the opening of China to the outside world. China's dramatic recognition of the use of market forces and the private sector over the years has made the political structure based primarily on the needs of a centrally planned economy obsolete. Some would argue that there was institutional decay leading to declining performance of the party, state, and bureaucracies. Apparently, the Chinese leaders were aware of the fact that political restructuring was necessary and unavoidable. Thus, Deng was brutally frank when he noted that the major problems of the leadership and cadre system of the party and the state were bureaucracy, overconcentration of power, patriarchal methods, life tenure in leading posts, and privileges of various kinds. To Deng, these problems were linked to the influence of feudalism and bourgeois thinking and had to be eliminated by distinguishing between the responsibilities of the party and that of the state. And he sought to reform the outmodeled sort of organizational and personal systems, amending the constitution, strengthening the legal system, grooming young leaders, and other measures. It must be emphasized, nevertheless, that Deng was abundantly clear that these political and organizational reforms were meant to strengthen the leadership of the CPC so as to meet the growing and challenging needs of the new China and towards China's modernization drive. The plan was to put these proposals on the table at the 13-Party Congress, deepen the reforms at the 14-Party Congress, and basically complete the reforms by the 15-Party Congress. Deng's criticisms and suggestions were taken up seriously, and after a period of research and investigation, the party considered it mature to put political reforms on the agenda of the 13th-Party Congress in October 1987. Thus, Zhao Ziyang, Deng's protege at the time, proposed formally to make efforts separating the responsibilities of the party and the state, strengthening the construction of a socialist legal system, reforming the personnel system, streamlining the state apparatus and other undertakings. However, the proposals at the 13th-Party Congress did not really have a chance to take off. The clampdown on demonstrations in June 1989 and the dismissal of Zhao Ziyang was a fatal blow to advocates of political reforms. Although political reforms were not really snuffed out completely, the tempo was slowed down and the scope narrowed. In the meantime, economic reforms were pressed on with full steam. This was especially true after Deng Xiaoping's famed tour of the South in early 1992. By the time of the 14th-Party Congress in October 1992, the CPC stated clearly its desire to establish what it called a socialist market economy, endorsing officially the necessity of borrowing the experiences and practices of the capitalist market economy. And when the 15th-Party Congress was held, Deng's thoughts and policies were uplifted to Deng Xiaoping's theory, making it the guiding ideology for China's modernization. As such, the party constitution stipulated that the CPC takes Marxist-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and Deng Xiaoping theory as to guide itself in terms of its actions. The thrust of Zhang's report was on economic reforms. Zhang highlighted China's developmental strategy at present and probably for the next 100 years as a strategy for a nation at a primary stage of socialism. Zhang's report endorsed, among other things, a joint stock companies for state-owned enterprises and acknowledged that the non-public sector is an important component of China's socialist market economy. While it's really beyond the purview of this course to analyze China's economic reforms, the point that should be noted is that political reforms has been trailing behind economic reforms. The Chinese were much more liberal and willing to borrow capitalistic economic experiences, but for the most part they were reluctant to follow Western political practices. However, it would be prudent to note that Zhang and his colleagues could not have failed to notice the relevance of political reforms. To many of them, it was probably more of a question of political feasibility. Obviously, it was politically unwise to bring up the issue of political reforms in the aftermath of the 1989 incident, even though selected administrative reforms were introduced. The concern with stability after the incident and the adverse developments against communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union would require Beijing to be more prudent in mapping out political reforms, as evidenced in the 14th-Party Congress in October 1992. Notably, the talk of separating the party from the state and decentralization of power proposed in the previous 13th-Party Congress in 1987 were not brought up again. Nonetheless, a socialist market economy endorsed by the party had to be supported by reforms to streamline the party and state administration to upgrade management and organizational efficiency. A new civil service system would have to be put in place as soon as possible. Laws would have to be enacted to bolster the introduction of market forces in the economy. Growing corruptions and other economic crimes would also denote the failure and problems of the political system. Obviously, sporadic hits against selected targets were not enough. Criticism, self-criticism, self-restraint, party disciplinary action against errant members, and the promotion of spiritual civilization would not be enough, and would have to be topped up with tough legal and political reforms. In other words, the problems created by the economic reforms would have to be tackled by political means. Moreover, the progress of the economy as a result of the economic reforms would also have to be rationalized and consolidated in ideological and political terms. Thus, on the eve of the 15-party Congress, there were already signs that political reforms would be taken up by the post-Deng leadership. Notably, there was mentioning of political reforms at the time of Deng's death as noted beforehand. In addition, there was the so-called Third Thought emancipation, sparked off by a speech of Jiang Zemin at the Central Party School in May 1997. This speech not only set the tone for the coming Party Congress, but gave rise to the hope that political reforms would be given a new lease of life. As Jiang and his colleagues surveyed the political scene, they probably thought it was opportune and necessary to relook political reforms with the fizzling out of opposition, ideological or otherwise, to such a move. For one thing, the realm of the revolutionary generation is gone as the course of nature took its toll on the old guard. Unlike the days where elder statesmen dominated the political scene and younger successors had to work at the behest of their patrons, the third generation leaders with Jiang as the core have a relatively free hand to run their own show. There were no doubt challenges from the remnants of the leftists attacking the reforms, particularly economic reforms, embracing capitalistic practices. The third generation leaders under Jiang were keen to put their stamp on future developments and map out new directions while adhering to the contributions of Deng Xiaoping theory. The third thought, emancipation, was probably useful to lay down the groundwork and conducive for a relook of political reforms in the future. In the light of these concerns with the fate of socialism, it would be wise for the post-Deng leaders to respond by highlighting, amongst other things, their emphasis on China's future political developments. China's economic reforms and the CPC's on-again, off-again approach to political reforms have had an impact on the nation's political institutions. There are clear signs that the political system has adapted to the new circumstances and that China's political system is becoming increasingly institutionalized. Institutionalization here means increased structural differentiation, more regularized decision-making processes, and more state autonomy from society. Adaptation can be said to have occurred in two different arenas, internal and external. Internal adaptation has happened in the following areas: the background of the party's members, the characteristics of the leadership, the incentive systems and selection criteria for the bureaucracy, and reform of the legal system. The impetus for these came from elite shock at the consequences of the Cultural Revolution and the obvious need to find successors. External adaptation refers to the extent to which interaction between state and society has changed. External adaptation has occurred in the following areas: the People's Congress and political participation, trade unions and mass organizations, non-state social and political groups, and the media. Less progress in institutionalizing the changes has been made in this arena, however. Political reform has brought several significant changes to the bureaucracy. First, with civil service reform, the CPC disaggregated state cadres into business elite, government officials, and employees of not-for-profit institutions. Different management methods are being developed for each sector. Separate incentive systems are also in operation, so much so that becoming a government official is now considerably less materially attractive than previously, especially for those living in China's coastal areas. Since 1993, civil servants in China have once again been selected through open competitive examinations. This is designed in part to raise the quality of the civil service and in part to demonstrate to the public that civil service jobs are not only available through open competition and not through personal connections. These changes should improve the quality of the civil service. The CPC hopes that the reforms will enhance its performance and subsequently its political legitimacy. However, it also realizes that the party has to adjust and rejuvenate itself to meet the needs of the new era. Thus, in terms of party affairs, efforts have been made to improve the quality of party cadres. And as far as party elites are concerned, it has been noted that all 7 members of the Standing Committee of the new Politburo of the 15th Party Congress in 1997 were basically technocrats, with the majority trained as engineers. Most new recruits in the early periods of the reform era of the Central Committee of the party were also more educated. In fact, the percentage of college-educated members in the Central Committee has increased from 44.3% in 1956 to 92.4% in 1997. Obviously, elite recruitment has transformed the party's leadership from revolutionaries to technocrats, in the hope that this could equip the party to deal with the more complex and oftentimes technical issues. Changes in elite recruitment are also accompanied by efforts to institutionalize a retirement system. For the most senior leaders in the party, efforts have been made to have a relatively less traumatic and more tranquil system of political exit. Finally, as the transfer of power is always a problem in Chinese politics, the third-generation leaders under Jiang attempted to build a group of fourth-generation leaders. Jiang and his colleagues knew all too well that a smooth political succession process was vital in maintaining the CPC's unchallenged position in Chinese politics. In this regard, the rise of Hu Jintao was notable. The evidence we have presented thus far suggests that China's formal Leninist political institutions continue to be relevant and useful, and citizens have been able to make them work. Moreover, at no time have party authorities considered any proposals that would have threatened the CPC's monopoly position. Official calls for reform were punctuated by the pro-democracy and anti-corruption protests of 1978, 1979, 1981, 1986, and 1989. During these early years of the reform era, the party's attention turned from reform to repression at times. Obviously, the CPC would like to see that the party could continue to dominate Chinese politics, and for political leaders in China, they will still insist that they would not follow the Western example in having a bi-party or multi-party systems and consider one-party dominance necessary in the developmental process. Thus, in spite of political reforms, the decisive role of the CPC in Chinese politics will probably continue unabated for quite some time. Currently, the legitimacy of the CPC is based more on the performance of China's economy, and it is increasingly changing towards patriotism as a benchmark. The legitimacy of the party could be undermined, mind you, by levels of corruption, and on another hand, by a serious economic downturn. As China's leaders are acutely aware, a sharp downturn in the fortunes of Chinese citizens after almost a generation of high growth and prosperity can be a recipe for instability. As we will discuss throughout our lectures, further reform of institutions linking state to society is required within the general demands of maintaining stability. This concludes our lecture on the onset of reforms. In our next set of lectures, we will be looking at contemporary institutions and their behavior. In fact, in our next lecture, we will be looking at bureaucratic operations and configurations.